Is chapter 12 of Gathering Blue. In chapter 11, Kira visits Annabella for more lessons about how to make colors. She goes by herself and she tells Annabella that she's followed by a beast. Annabella tells her that beasts are not real, that it is people dressing up to scare her. So Kira, when she returns home, she goes to visit Thomas, the boy that works with the wood, the carpenter, and they talk about the beasts. Kira tells Thomas that her father was taken by beasts, but they've never seen these beasts. As Kira lays in bed, she starts to think to herself, are beasts even real? And if they're not real, what happened to my father? This is chapter 12. When the bell for rising rang to wake up, Kira awoke with a sense that something had changed. She had an awareness of a difference, but had forgotten what the difference was. She sat for a moment on the edge of her bed, thinking, but she could not grasp or understand whatever it was, and finally she stopped trying. Sometimes she knew lost memories and forgotten dreams came back more easily if you put them out of your mind. Outside it was stormy, rainy. Winds shook the trees and blew a sheet of heavy rain against the building. The hard ground below had turned to mud overnight, and it was clear that Kira would not go to the dyer's cot today, to Annabella's. Just as well, she thought, there was much work to do on the robe, and autumn's start, the time of the gathering, was approaching, where the singer that wears the robe tells the story of the history of the community. Recently, Jameson had been stopping by sometimes twice a day to see the progress she had made. He seemed pleased and happy by her work. Here, he said to her just the day before yesterday, smoothing his hand across the large, undecorated place, is where you will start your own work. After this year's gathering, after you finish with the restoration, improving the robe, you will have this entire section to work on for years to come. Kira touched the place where his hand lay. She tried to determine whether her fingers would feel the magic there, but there was only emptiness. There was a feeling of unfulfilled need. So Jameson's just telling her, look, this is going to be the area of the dress that you'll work on in the future. He seemed to sense her uncertainty and reassured her. Don't worry, he said. We will explain to you what we want pictured there. Kira didn't reply. His reassurance troubled her. It wouldn't be instruction that she needed, it would be the magic to come back to her hands. Remembering the conversation, Kira thought suddenly, Jameson, I can ask him about the beasts. He had told her that he had been part of the hunt that day, that he had seen her father's death. And maybe she would ask Matt too. Wild little thing that he was, Kira had no doubt that Matt had crossed the boundaries often and had gone to places tykes were not supposed to go to. She laughed quietly, thinking of Matt and his mischief and the trouble he makes. He spied on everything, knew everything. Had she and Thomas not stopped him, he would have tagged along with the men on the hunt and put himself in danger. Perhaps he had done it before. Perhaps he had seen beasts. When the tender came with the morning breakfast, with the morning meal, Kira asked that the lights be lit. The rainstorm made the room dim, dark, even beside the window where she sat to work. Finally, she settled herself with the outspread robe and placed the frame around the newest section, waiting to be repaired. As she had done so often, she followed with her eyes and fingers the long story of the world portrayed on the robe. The starting point, long fixed now, with green water, the dark beasts on its shore, and the men bloodied by the hunt. So she's talking about the design on the dress, the pictures. Beyond, villages appeared, with dwellings of all kinds. Curving stitches of smoke from fires were threaded with dull purplish greys. It was fortunate that it needed no repair, because Kira had no threads, had no colours to match. She thought they had been dyed with basil, and Annabella had told her how difficult the basil was and how badly it stained your hand. So she's just talking about what she sees on the robe, now that she's fixing all the colours. Then complex, whirling patches of fire, oranges, reds, and yellows. Here and there on the robe, these fires appeared, a repetitive pattern of ruin, and within the intricately stitched patterns of the bright destructive threads of fire, Kira could see figures of humans betrayed, people destroyed, their tiny villages crumbling, and later, even larger, much more splendid and nice towns burned and ravished by fiery destruction. In some places on the road, there was a feeling of entire worlds ending. Yet, always, there would emerge, nearby, new growth, new people. So she's talking basically that the story being told is that this community has been destroyed many, many times, okay? It's been burned down so many times. So ruin, destruction, rebuilding, ruin again, regrowth. Kira followed the scenes with her hand as larger and greater cities appeared and larger, greater destruction took place. The cycle was so regular that its pattern took on a clear form, an up and down movement, wave-like. From the tiny corner where it began, where the first ruin came, it enlarged upon itself. The fires grew as the villages grew. All of them were still tiny, created from the smallest stitches and combinations of stitches. But she could still see their pattern of growth and how each time the ruin was worse and the rebuilding more difficult. So again, just talking about how all of the colors and the pictures on the dress that she's working on tell the story of how the destruction of the community was, how they would rebuild and then something would destroy it. Then they would rebuild again. But each time they rebuilt, it gets more difficult and more difficult. But the sections of Serenity were exquisite, amazing. Miniature flowers of countless hues flourished in meadows streaked with golden threaded sunlight. Human figures embraced. The pattern of the peaceful times felt immensely tranquil compared to the tortured chaos of others. So she's talking about the other side now. So on one area, there's the destruction of the communities and the buildings, but on the other, there's these beautiful fields and grasses and flowers. Tracing with her finger the white and pink tingled clouds against pale skies of grey or green, Kira wished again for blue. The colour of calm. What was it that Annabella had said? That they had blue yonder? What did that mean? Who were they? And where was yonder? More unanswered questions. Great sheets of rain spattered against the window, distracting her. Kira sighed and watched the trees bend and sway in the wind. Thunder muttered in the distance. She wondered where Matt was, what he was doing in this weather. She knew that ordinary people, those who lived near the place where she and her mother had shared their house, their cot, would be indoors today. The men sullen and edgy, the women complaining loudly because weather kept them from their usual chores and jobs. Tykes, confined inside, would be fighting and then wailing in response to swift, backhanded slaps from their mothers. Her own life with her soft-spoken widowed mother had been different, but it had set her apart too and made others, like Vanderer, hostile and mean. Kira? She heard Thomas's voice and his knock at her door. Come in. He came and stood by her window, eyeing, looking at the rain. I was just wondering what Matt's up to in this weather, Kira said. Thomas began to laugh. Well, I can answer that. He's up to finishing my breakfast. He arrived early this morning, dripping wet. He said his mother threw him out because he was noisy and troublesome, causing problems. I think he just wanted breakfast, though. Branch 2, the dog? Yes, Branch 2, of course. As if in response, they heard the tap-tapping of the dog's feet in the corridor. Then Branch appeared in the doorway, his head cocked up, ears up, bent tail wagging exuberantly, an excited dog. Kira knelt and scratched behind his ear. Kira? Thomas was still staring through the window at the rain. She looked up from the dog. I heard it again in the night. I'm certain of it this time. The sound of a child crying. It seemed to come from the floor below. She looked at him and saw that he was concerned. I wonder, Kira, he said hesitantly, would you go with me to explore a bit? I suppose it could just be the sound of wind. It was true that outside the wind was relentless, always windy. Tree branches lashed the side of the building and torn leaves whirled away. The sound of the storm, however, was nothing like the sound of a crying child. Maybe an animal? Kira suggested. I've heard cats yowling so that they sound like babies and colicky bellies. Cats? Thomas repeated dubiously. Well, maybe. Or a young goat. They make a crying sound. Thomas shook his head. It wasn't a goat. Well, no one ever said we couldn't explore, Kira commented. Not to me, anyway. Nor me. All right, then. I'll go with you. The light's not good for working this morning, anyway. She stood, and Branch wriggled with anticipation. What about Matt? I suppose we should take him along. Take me where? Matt suddenly appeared in the doorway, damp, wet-haired, with bare feet with crumbs on his chin, jam on the edges of his mouth, and wearing a too large woven shirt belonging to Thomas. Shall we be having an adventure? Matt? Kira remembered her intention to ask him. Have you ever seen a beast? A real one? Matt's face lighted. Billions and billions! He made a beast face, teeth exposed. He roared, and his dog jumped away from him in alarm. Kira rolled her eyes and looked at Thomas. Here, Branchy. Matt, his beast disguise abandoned, squatted beside the dog, who came forward and sniffed him. Some smearies for you. He grinned as the dog licked breakfast from his face. Yes, we'll have ourselves an adventure, Kira told him. She laid the protective cover over the robe. We thought we'd explore a bit. We've never been on the floor below this one. Matt's eyes widened in delight at the idea of an exploration. I heard a noise last night, Thomas explained. Probably nothing, but we thought we'd go take a look. Noise don't never be nothing, Matt pointed out. And quite rightly, Kira thought. Well, it's probably nothing important, Thomas amended. But maybe it be interesting, Matt said eagerly, excited. Together, followed by the dog, the three started down the corridor toward the stairs. So the end of the chapter. So Kira wakes up and it's a cold, wet, stormy day. And she's thinking about the beasts a little bit in her mind, and she's not really sure what to think. As she's sitting in her room, she's trying to work on the dress, on the robe, because soon it needs to be ready. And she's looking at the stories that have been told of the community being destroyed and then rebuilt, and then destroyed and rebuilt with great fires. And on the other side, there's all these beautiful stories of flowers and trees and green and sky. Then she goes and talks to Thomas, and they start talking about hearing a sound downstairs and that they want to go explore with Matt. We will see what happens in the next chapter.